Hi there. I'm Shane Carlson. I'm a director of enterprise architecture at ServiceNow, and I have the distinct pleasure of talking with Mr. Charles Betts today from Forrester. Charles and I have known each other for a long time in the industry, and actually I have a hard time calling him Charles because I call him Charlie. We've been around for a long time, had a lot of great conversations over the years around this, and we're going to get into some great topics about the role of the modern EA today in the enterprise and talk a little bit about how ServiceNow can help the EAs gain more visibility into the work that they do. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and have Charlie introduce himself here in a minute. And if you have any questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll answer them as we can get to them and try and give answers to a lot of those along the way. So with that, Charlie, kick it off.
So it's been now about a year that I've been the research director for enterprise architecture after having been a practitioner for a few more years than that. And of course, we still hear comments like this. There's EA is troubled sometimes, but I would say that half of organizations have it. And we continue to hear every day from enterprise architecture leaders who are absolutely making a real difference in their organizations, with their organization's digital and IT strategy, and especially in these increasingly challenging times. There are some issues, and I want to be upfront with this problem of the ivory tower. The era where enterprise architects could stay somewhat disengaged, somewhat remote, think big thoughts, develop high-level reference architectures that maybe were consulted, maybe weren't. If those days ever existed, they're of course now long past, and architects are being challenged to be directly valuable in more ways than ever. Because of course we are in some very challenging times. I don't have to recite the headlines. I think we all know that there are economic challenges, social challenges, political challenges, and all of this tends to result in pressure on the modern organization so that questions of what do we prioritize, where do we remain invested, what is our portfolio, these all are more and more critical to answer. But EA has had this pattern of coming and going. Organizations start EA and then they lose faith in it, they lose confidence, they lose interest, they shut EA down. Then something bad happens and oh my goodness, well, if we had EA, maybe that bad thing wouldn't have happened. I mentioned that half of the organizations we survey say they have an architecture organization. 30% say that they used to have an organization with architecture in the name, but no longer do. I think that this is very wasteful, this kind of pattern of inconsistent management. If you're going to have EA, you should stick with it. And EA, we know, can provide great value. It is actually very important, especially when belts need tightening. We know that part of challenging times means that portfolios are scrutinized. Do we still need to be doing this? Do we still need to be in this business? Well, as I often like to say, there are three ways to rationalize a portfolio. You can use command and control, basically base it on the opinions and impressions of your most senior leaders, and they can just cut and be done with it. The trouble is that, as we've seen too often, this is done without sufficient context, without sufficient understanding. Or you can make the decisions very opaquely. Nobody's really accountable. Just stuff just happens. The decision was made in the passive voice. The third way, and the way we recommend at Forrester, is that you need rational collaboration. You need it when times are good, and you need it when times are hard. You need to be transparent, and you need to use clear criteria for making the hard decisions about what you're going to keep doing and what you're going to cease doing. When you have three things and you realize we really only need one of these things. Again, how are those decisions made? Well, architecture provides you a set of tools for doing that, as I'm going to discuss a little bit. Ultimately, EA always emerges. It always comes back. It's essential when you are considering new investments. Most organizations are aware, once they get to a certain size, that they have a technology portfolio. You say, well, we've got 10 different flavors of relational database. Do you need 10 different flavors of relational database? How many different offerings and products are within your cloud provider? How many different ways of persisting data are there within AWS itself, the Amazon cloud? Do you need to be using all of those different ways? Sprawl is a problem, and sprawl translates in many cases to technical debt. But again, you need a clear and rational approach for identifying and then consolidating so that you have a more rational portfolio. I do take issue, and we've taken issue on the record at Forrester with the Agile Manifesto's one statement. We appreciate much of Agile and we are very supportive of it, but there is a statement in the Agile Manifesto that the best architectures emerge from self-organizing teams. I'll be blunt. This was people whistling in the dark 20 years ago. It's not true. We have seen so much disconfirming evidence. The best architectures emerge when people are paid to think about architecture, bottom line. And architecture can be agile. Absolutely.
Charlie, I want to kind of tie this part back to something you had on the last slide about the three ways. And
Sure.
you talked about a command and control approach. And very often when we see the kind of economic headwinds that we're seeing right now in the market, leadership tends to go directly to the command and control route first. And when we talk about things like being agile, making clear decisions and things of that nature, that command and control approach very often flies in the face of logic. And I wrote an article about this recently as I was thinking about it, because I'm seeing some of these trends already in our customers, wherein we go through and we start talking about building out plans, we build out roadmaps with the customers, we help them think about things, and someone at the top says, no, we just need to cut these things out of the system without any conversation, without any due diligence around that. How do you see EAs that are currently working in corporations who are facing that type of command and control? How are you seeing them respond to that? How are you seeing them and the work that you're doing from a research point of view challenge that perspective so that folks kind of go in to these making clear decisions that benefit them in the long term and not just cut costs in the short term?
It's a hard challenge, Shane. I think we have to be honest. There is a point at which the human being under stress shuts down and will not deal with complexity. And yet the trouble is these are complex systems. So it's so tempting to simply say, well, it appears obvious that if we just stop doing X, we won't have a problem. But the trouble is that there are always, in so many cases, hidden variables. There's feedback loops. You think that by, well, I think a well-known one is increasing the size of the highways. You think that will lead to less traffic and less rush hour. Well, there's pretty good evidence that actually the opposite happens. There's many cases of you push a system in a certain direction, you think it will move in that direction, it moves in the opposite direction. And yet this is very hard to explain to people, especially when time is short. And so I think, the best EAs are systems thinkers, and they have been advocating for a systems view that understands that systems are complex, that it is good to change them incrementally, it's good to change them experimentally, and look for information and look for signal. When you perturb the system in a certain way, what did it do? And radical changes do tend to have dramatically unforeseen consequences in complex systems. And the thing is if the senior leaders have never experienced that and they go and start making huge cuts and drastic alterations to complex systems, they're going to learn those lessons very quickly. Hopefully at that point, they'll have an enterprise architect in the room to point these things out.
Absolutely.
So at Forrester, we have an overall framework for enterprise architecture. We call it the outcome-driven architecture model. And I'll be the first to say this is a very high-level architecture. Call it a marketecture, if you will. I won't be offended. Architectures have their place. They still map out a space and say, this is what's in scope and this is what we're trying to think about. But this particular diagram, I mean, it had certain driving principles behind it. We wanted to base it on the idea of an impact map. How is it that basic concerns, basic activities ultimately translate to outcomes? And ultimately, that is, I think, one of the most important thought processes and points of view for the modern architect to adopt. How is it that what you're doing actually contributes to the growth and resilience and sustainability of your organization? Now, from the chief EA's point of view, and some of this diagram was definitely positioned for the chief enterprise architect, we have a set of architecture principles. We're actually going to rename those to the architecture foundation. And the challenge many architecture groups have is they aren't grounded in this kind of foundation. I'll talk specifically about these different values or different precepts that you could say are so important. But you have to ground your capabilities in that kind of a foundation in order to stay relevant. And then you're in a position to influence the delivery of products, projects, and services to your organization's overall outcomes. Forrester, we use concepts of adaptive, creative, and resilient. And you can also translate those to more traditional objectives like top line, bottom line, et cetera. So if we talk a little bit further about the 6 principles, EA must drive specific outcomes for the business. You can use abstractions like adaptive, creative, resilient, or you can simply say, well, it's about increasing revenue, reducing cost, mitigating risk, and improving customer experience.
So I'd like to chime in on this one for a second. This kind of hits back to the question I asked you a little bit earlier, and something we're seeing a lot in the customer base is if you take all of those 4 things together, very often a couple of those actually seem in conflict with one another, right? Like improving customer satisfaction typically involves investment. At the same time, you're trying to reduce costs. And this is one of the things that we're challenging the market in some ways and saying you can do both if you invest appropriately and reduce costs in the right ways. What are you seeing when you talk to folks about this particular conversation around value and knowing that some of these things may actually be in conflict in some cases?
Well, at Forrester, we are extremely committed to the concept of customer obsession. And we have a massive survey program. I think something like 700,000 data points a year that we're harvesting, and we're doing advanced statistical analysis. We're doing factor analysis and cluster analysis. And our most forward-looking research, when all of that comes together, basically has demonstrated for a number of years now that customer-obsessed, customer-centric organizations are 2 times more successful across the board. Customer centricity absolutely pays. And for those with a background in business, this is not surprising. Peter Drucker was saying this for decades, and he's still right. So absolutely, you need to be customer obsessed, customer centric. That does pay for itself. There's so much evidence. Obviously, on a day-to-day basis, trade-offs have to be made. But these tend to be the top things people wind up trying to balance at the most senior level. This is the most intricate architecture diagram I will inflict on you. But I had to have a bunch of circles and lines at one point.
Are you really an architect if you don't have a diagram with circles and lines going all over the place?
Yeah. If I don't have some spaghetti there, people will question my architecture credentials. So here's the spaghetti diagram, but I do get a lot of positive feedback on this diagram. People saying to me, just some person said to me, oh, I took a screenshot of that diagram and I started using it for my own business. I mean, the whole point is that this is a method example. What you will put in will be different. But the key point is that so many architects are unable to draw that line of sight from what they're doing on a daily basis on the bottom up to the more high level conversation. And I'll just digress a little bit. It's one of the best pieces of mentoring I ever received. I was at a reception and I was trying to talk to a senior IT leader. And as one does when one is younger and less experienced, I went a little too technical, a little too quickly. And this senior leader listened politely and then excused themselves. And a mentor of mine was watching the whole exchange. And the mentor pulled me over and said words I will never forget. He said, Charlie, it's very simple. Top line, bottom line, risk. If you can't break what you're talking down into those three things, just don't approach a person at that level. Now, being Forrester and with the customer obsession discussion we had, I put customer experience at the top as well. Unapologetically, it belongs there. But the trouble so many architects have is they're trying to reduce redundancy. And if somebody asks, well, why? They'll make some vague statement about efficiency, but they don't draw the line of sight. Let me walk through just one of the lines of sight. Y'all can read this. But for example, if you have split your spend, your expenditures for, say, we'll pick on relational databases again. If you've split that expenditure across 10 different vendors, you don't have leverage with any one of those vendors. However, when you consolidate it, you can have a conversation where you say, look, I'm giving you 95% of my business. What are you going to do for me? And I would speculate this conversation probably goes back maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years, to the Silk Road running from
Yep.
the Middle East to China. I mean, these are not new conversations. It's not that hard for an enterprise architect, who tend to be smart people, to draw this final line of sight, to say, look, if we've got a smaller attack surface, it's going to be easier to secure. Well, right there, you're talking the CISO's language.
Yep.
But so many times I hear architects and they're doing great work in the bottom layer, and they're not telling the story in that critical interim layer. They're not able to tell that story in the elevator on demand, and then their organization is at risk. And it's really too bad, because architecture is contributing to these outcomes, but it does it a little less directly than the current favorite, fair-haired AI project or whatever. Architect. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just say, balancing across these is where I see the challenge for a lot of the architects that we speak to. Is they tend to over optimize around cost more than anything. And in some cases, to the point where they're introducing fragility into the environment because they're not looking at risk to the business. They're not looking at customer experience, and not very often are they looking at things like income. How can we help drive top line revenue with the decisions that we're making around these systems? And so it's
and we'll get to that, because architects, I think, play a real role, especially with the platforms conversation nowadays.
Absolutely.
So obviously we could spend more time on this one, but architects manages by influence. Architecture managers by influence, not just by mandate. Architects need to have credibility so that they can influence. And reality is, if you win 70% of your battles in a given year, you're basically succeeding. You are course correcting and you're steering. You will not get your way all the time, but you're just there as a consistent voice on behalf of the long term and the bigger dynamics that you're seeing and that you're paid to understand. Architecture can be adaptive and agile itself, and it can support agile development. In particular, I'm going to talk about platforms and why architecture is so important there. I'll get to that in a little bit. but certainly architects also must have an understanding of Agile as an actual set of principles, as an actual history. I think, Shane, we're getting a little better about this, but it was embarrassing even 5 years ago. Sometimes I would talk to an enterprise architect who thought that agile just meant nimble, that they could just go to a dictionary or a thesaurus and say, "Oh, I know what agile is. It means being nimble," And like, no, there's a whole history there. You have to read the manifesto. You have to understand the history of Scrum and how Scrum emerged, out of, some of the product development conversations coming before it. There is a deep and rich set of knowledge there that as an architect, you need to master, or you are going to have continued problems with your agile group. Am I usually?
Absolutely. I was having a conversation the other day with somebody about, the origins of Agile, kind of even pre-manifesto. And
Mhm.
you look at things like, RUP, Rational Unified Process, was, I would say, a precursor to some of the Agile movement. And the concept of serial and the large, iterative and the small was kind of the hybrid approach to the traditional waterfall and where we ultimately went with Agile. But one of the things that I think got left behind in the last, I'd say, 10 years is exactly what you said. It isn't just about being nimble and moving quickly. It's about moving smart, right? Think fast, move smart, move in the right direction, and don't leave critical parts of the conversation behind as you're moving forward.
And so much of it has to do with the fact that software development is product development. It's R&D, not production. And that's one of the
Yes.
other failures, and people just assuming that you can write software on an assembly line. I still see that thinking out there that, we should just make this more repeatable. Why can't this be more repeatable? And I'm thinking when I hear those things, you just really don't understand the history if you're on a quest for repeatability in an R&D context. That's the whole
Yeah.
point of R&D. It's not
Yeah.
repeatable, so you have to generate information. Yeah.
Just like in the auto industry, right? Your research and development is creating concepts. They're testing
Exactly.
ideas. They're modeling things. And then once they have the model set, they've built the architectural patterns for that particular model. Then it goes into production, and that's where the assembly line comes in.
Exactly. And just lather, rinse, repeat that chain. I think we're still going to be saying that for a few more years yet. you know?
I, I've made a fine career out of giving that advice for 25 plus years, as you have.
Exactly. And part of the problem, I think the MBA programs are, I don't know. Let's not go there. We used to see big batch architecture. We're going to do the architecture and then it's done. It's like, no, it's never done. I think that this is fairly obvious, and I don't see as many people falling into this trap. But the idea that architecture is realistic, that you need to be able to actually visit the work site, put on the digital equivalent of a hard hat. You should be hands-on to a degree. I will put a bit of a caveat out there that for enterprise architects at scale, well, I was an enterprise architect at large scale, and my portfolio included literally over 100 systems, some of which were built in a wide variety of programming languages running on various platforms, and some of which were, of course, bought and then deployed. And some of those systems that were purchased could be configured in almost a programming-like way. What was I supposed to be hands-on with? And were these teams interested in me being hands-on? Well, I can tell you the answer to that in many cases would have been a resounding no. So it's all well and good to say architects should be hands-on, but let's be sensitive to the context here. Now, also, we are, however, in a different world. One of the other issues I would run into, say 10 years ago, was even access to production grade systems was not simple. You didn't just log into a Unix box. They were expensive. They were tightly controlled. I mean, sure, some crazy people might have a Sun Solaris pizza box in their basement, but it wasn't something that the average architect had in their pocket. You were dealing with whatever laptop you were assigned, and that was that. However, it's very different now, as many people know. You can run Linux in virtual machines on your laptop. You can set up whole clusters. You can run Kubernetes. All of this infrastructure is now readily available to not just the architect, but to anybody with an interest in computing and computers, which is an awesome advance forward. And I do think it is important for architects to have that kind of hands-on level grounding where it makes sense for them. I think it's actually super exciting that you can access production grade platforms and play with them in the small on these immensely powerful machines that we have that we're just carrying around with us in our backpacks.
Yeah, I'll make one comment there. I'll make a couple comments here. The first comment is you'd be surprised how cheap those Sun pizza boxes are on eBay right now.
Right.
But more importantly, the concept of getting out of the ivory tower, I think, is great. And I think in 10 years ago, even the only time you ever saw was an architect was when they showed up to say no at an architecture design meeting or an architecture review board. And now more and more these architects are embedded in the conversation. They're at the table, they're talking through things, they're guiding decisions. And as a part of that, I think back to the concept of hands-on keyboards and knowing and being proficient in the systems that they're responsible for. I have this challenge with my team. I've got about a dozen EAs that work with our customers, and they're constantly asking, how hands-on keyboard should I be? And I think the answer is enough to be credible in the conversations that you're having, and enough to know that as you're making design decisions, to know what the impact is potentially to the folks who will actually be building those systems and doing that work. So you don't have to be, run circles around the folks that are doing the work today, because systems evolve, technology evolve, all of these things move along, but you should know enough about what's happening in those systems to understand the impact of those decisions you're making and the guidance you're giving.
Yep. Very well stated. So finally, I think accountability is absolutely key. And this is, I've had more than one client, when we go through these principles, really drill in here, because ultimately that's the sense of the problem of the ivory tower, the sense that somebody isn't accountable. They say no, and then there's no appeal, there's no recourse, there's no consequence to them. So it's easy to say no. And architecture absolutely can and should be measured and held accountable. Now, it doesn't mean that we can measure moving averages on some kind of a Six Sigma paradigm, but we can certainly look at things like sentiment. We can look at key cases and discuss those. We can look at reuse. We can look at technical debt. That's a really popular one to think more and more about. How do we quantify that? That could actually be a whole nother webinar, Shane. Boy, that conversation.
That's a weekly conversation for my team. Is measuring technical debt on our platform, helping our customers measure it in their environments, et cetera. And I don't think we have a great answer to that yet. I think we're getting closer and closer. I think for each customer, the key is be consistent and how they define it in their organizations and how they measure it, or as consistent as possible, knowing the diversity of systems. But I really think that we all have some work to do as an industry to kind of better understand technical debt and how we evaluate that and its impact as we move forward. And also to not be afraid of leaving that technical debt behind and not sticking to these sunk cost fallacies that a lot of companies have around, well, I've invested so much money in these systems, I need to keep mending them and fixing them, as opposed to just leaving that technical debt behind and moving forward.
Exactly. Again, very, 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 very well stated. So those are the foundations. And from the foundations, we have then a set of capabilities. Now, I'm going to spend a little less time on this because this is actually very, very comfortable for many architects and architecture leaders to think about at least three of these. For example, who is an architect? What is the career path for architects? I'll make a couple observations. I don't think that architect should be the sole terminal career point for engineers. I think there should be dual paths. Organizations where you graduate from being an engineer to an architect, I think, become a little dysfunctional. And I could talk about that in depth. I also think that it is good for organizations to govern the use of the architect title via an architecture program. Now, this is not the same thing as saying all architects should report up to a single leader, which in large organizations is not how it works and not how I would recommend it working. You're going to have federated architecture, but the trick is to then say, if you have this title, there's certain expectations that come with the title, including a defined set of training. This is a tall order for organizations, but the largest organizations actually move in this direction. So just a couple of observations. Think carefully about who is an architect, but most architect leaders do that. Moving from people to practices, architects wear many hats. And the sheer variety of things I was called on to do as an architect. I mean, sure, I did models, I did process flows, I did systems interaction diagrams, but I also found myself consulting on various topics. Sometimes I was given the role of like an ombudsman. An ombudsman is somebody you go to when you're just at your wit's end. And people would come to me and say, Charlie, people tell me that the process is supposed to work this way, but it doesn't. And you're my last hope. Walk me through what's going on. And sometimes I would then flush out issues with systems and the operating model. Sometimes I found myself playing the role of shuttle diplomat between organizational areas where relationships had so irretrievably broken down, they wouldn't talk to each other, and yet we had to coordinate them. And so I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between these two areas, trying to get them aligned using every last bit of diplomacy I was able to muster, and wondering to myself, with all respect to the open group, where is this covered in TOGAF? Where is this covered in the enterprise architecture method? So yeah.
You do know that PaaS actually stands for Peacemaker as a Service, right?
Exactly. So you get pulled into a lot of things, and it does start with some of the basics. And of course, we love our artifacts as architects. We do all of the systems and data and process and capability mapping. We could spend whole webinars on this, and it's important, and managing the artifacts is important. This is where you get into conversations about repositories, which I think you are doing a little work on lately at ServiceNow.
We are indeed.
So it's definitely, there's structured languages and study that needs to happen there. Ultimately, this is just a high level view of even just what we might call a basic set of architecture artifacts, customer journey maps, and they've evolved over time. I wouldn't have identified customer journey mapping as an architectural artifact 10 years ago, but I certainly would now. Capability modeling's been around for a long time, super important when you're especially trying to resolve redundancy, identify are these two things of like nature or not. You use capability mapping. It's very important.
I'll make a comment here on the customer journey mapping. This is something we've been doing a lot of in our conversations recently, and just helping understand the totality of that customer journey. And I think this is kind of the graduation or the maturity of architecture as a practice in a lot of companies, where previously architects were very myopically focused around a single domain, a single set of solutions, a single set of capabilities. But a true enterprise architect is looking at the business architecture. They're looking at that user journey all the way across the stack, regardless of how many different systems it traverses, regardless of how many left turns, right turns it takes, and looking at things like sentiment analysis along that journey and things that are very important to that customer experience that you called out earlier.
Absolutely. All of that is now in scope. Now, here's the one. I said there were 4 and that people will talk about all 3. This is where architecture is weak. So you have architects doing architecture, creating architectural artifacts. 1, 2, 3. What does it matter? Who cares? It means nothing unless you have an engagement model. I often think that the engagement model starts in the service catalog. Now, this is where organizations should absolutely document, this is what the EA team does, this is what you can expect from them, this is how to reach them, this is how to bring them into your project, this is how to get the necessary services you need. And beyond just a simple request and workflow kinds of things, you need to have an operating model conception. Are the architects workflow driven? Are they there to approve or disapprove things that are submitted via tickets and work orders, or are they embedding? Are they collaborating more directly? These are very important questions. What does it mean that you have somebody writing a 50-page reference architecture, which I do not dismiss out of hand? Sometimes it is useful for somebody to sit down and write 50 pages. But if and only if that 50 pages is going to actually inform subsequent decision making. So, what is the engagement model for all of this architecture work you're doing? And if you haven't thought enough about this, I urge you, go think about it now, because this is also where the dreaded ivory tower reputation creeps in, is if you're not clear on how you engage and what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, how architects show up. And this is where I break it all out. We have, I believe, and I've been trying to count and come up with kind of a rationalized taxonomy about the different ways that architecture can make a difference. Architecture, for a long time, has, when it's mature, had a seat at the table in approving the portfolio investments. And architecture has often checked deliverables via workflow. That's the classic notorious architecture review, and people don't like it much. But my advice is never to throw out a tool in the toolbox. Okay, for a while, everything, the architecture review is a hammer, everything looked like a nail until people got really irritated with architecture. Still, I think it is useful to have a workflow for the largest, most critical systems investments that are flowing through financial approval. Architecture should be looped in at some point, just not in the same kind of routine transactional sense that we've seen in years past. The emerging alternative is to embed the trained architects. And it can be actually sitting with the teams, or it can be more of a temporary consultative, kind of an enabling team approach. There's a few different ways to make that work. One of the most interesting new developments, and I can name names because US Bank went on the record, they submitted to the Forrester Enterprise Architecture Awards, which by the way are open. They train the broader community, not just the enterprise architects, but the developers. They are training the developers on broader architecture principles. And much of the developer training as a new developer onboards into US Bank is actually driven by architecture. I had never heard of this or thought of it before last year. I think it's a brilliant idea, and it contributed to them being one of the top placed organizations in our EA awards last year.
Yeah, we're actually doing a similar thing in our EA team. Myself and my peers, we actually realize that in order to scale effectively, we actually need to teach some of these principles deeper into the organization so people think similarly to an architect. So they ask the right questions that by the time we show up into a conversation, that they've already asked some of the key questions. They've shaped the narrative and the conversation that we want to have with our customers around where we can go and how we can fit into their overall architecture, to the point where we actually run an EA boot camp that we put all of our EAs through, but additionally invite folks from our field organizations into to train them as well.
Yep, that's exactly right. I think it's such an important way of getting out of the Department of No kind of trap that architectures have fallen into. Another way of getting out of the Department of No is to be the passionate advocate for the reusable platform. Think about it. You can either come at people with a checklist, and ask, well, did you follow all the things in my checklist? Or you take a proactive approach and build your checklist into the DevOps pipeline as part of the platform engineering. And at that point, in order to deploy to the platform, people are following your checklist, they're following the architecture principles, but they're doing so to some extent on their own terms and on their own time. You're not putting yourself in as a gate, a human in the loop gate, where you're going to introduce delay because you've got to enforce the checklist. Instead, the checklist is automated. And yes, I know, build time sometimes doesn't happen instantaneously, but nevertheless, the whole mental model, I think, changes for the developer because it's not a human being telling you no. It's the computer telling you no. Well, the computer's been telling me no ever since I tried and failed to compile my first C program, right?
If we took computers telling us no as the definitive answer, we'd have never gone to the moon. We'd never have electric cars. I mean, there's a lot of things we wouldn't have today.
So the thought process changes. It's like, okay, the build is breaking. I need to figure out what I got to do to stop breaking the build. Oh, they put an S-bomb check in the build, and I might grump a little bit about how, the build criteria are a bit of a moving target. But nevertheless, it's in my purview to then go figure out what I got to do to make the build go and not break. And again, it's not a human in the loop with the checklist. And I think that that's really where architecture just needs to get out of that business as much as absolutely possible. And oh, by the way, security professionals, I'm looking at you too, right?
Agree.
These human in the loop
Agree.
checklists, just, we want to save those kind of interactions for the really strategic, high value add stuff on a routine transactional basis. Folks, we have the automation. We've been figuring it out now, for 15 years, how to automate these kinds of things. So what this winds up being then, and I want to close with some of the discussion on the platform teams, we wind up seeing, and the modern architect is dealing with this new set of dynamics where it used to be application development was top left. You developed applications, and then 3/4 of the problem was either building infrastructure or operating applications and infrastructure. So you had basically 3/4 of the problem was the light blue. But now in this depiction, we see the gradual expansion of the product teams and then practices like infrastructure as code and cloud, where you see this rebalancing of boundaries. And when I showed this diagram to folks 5 years ago, they said, well, it's just all going to be product teams. Everything, I know is just going to go away. That actually didn't happen, and I think for a number of good reasons. There is this problem of undifferentiated heavy lifting, where you can call it that. You can say we need shared services. I don't really care what you call it. You can say a paved road strategy, but at the end of the day, there's not a lot of value add in having 15 different flavors of data persistence. And certainly, if you say one of my product teams, bought monitoring tool X, they bought New Relic, and the next product team bought Dynatrace. That's just crazy. That's just crazy talk. I mean, why would you do such a thing? And yet, if you don't have a concept of platform teams, you are in fact going to see that kind of dysfunctional behavior, and we hear about it. Not making things up. So, yeah.
I mean, there's a place for concepts like no ops and other things. I think for certain disciplines of development.
Yep.
But the reality is that if there's not someone somewhere looking at the overall strategy of how all of these tools come together, complement each other, and drive value, then you're going to create a lot of chaos. You're going to create a lot of technical debt, and you're going to create a lot of fragility in your organization.
I talked to a legit unicorn, not one of the big ones, but still a legit unicorn at ChefConf about 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. And they had tried the experiment of saying, we don't need a NOC or anything resembling a NOC. We don't need a help desk or anything resembling that. It's just all going to be the product teams. And it was absolutely a catastrophe. The experiment didn't run long. But what they wound up with was, I think you can guess, a lot of finger pointing, a lot of, my system is fine based on my telemetry. What's wrong with yours? And nobody owning the overall customer impact. And so they had to wind that back.
Yeah, we just shifted the blame the network or blame the Unix guys conversation to a different part of the OSI model.
Yeah, exactly. So the platform teams are there for a reason. This is our definition. It's loosely based on things that they've said in team topologies. I think it's a super important conversation nowadays, and one that I would urge the enterprise architect to be thinking a lot about. And it's not just a matter of reinventing a bunch of functional silos and saying, oh, I've got an existing infrastructure organization, so we're just going to call it the platforms organization, because the difference is that platforms need to run as products. They need to be concerned for value, viability, usability. They need to be tracking things like sentiment, instead of saying, well, I've got a queue full of tickets and you'll get it when you get it.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with a ticketing infrastructure. A lot of people think ticketing is the root of all evil. It's not. It's just work tracking. The issue is how ticketing is being fit into the overall product model, and is it resulting in unacceptable delays? That's the issue with ticketing.
Yeah, one comment I'd like to make on that, the concept of platforms lowering cognitive load is obviously I'm very biased. I work for a company that builds itself as a platform company, but I've been in this industry for 25 plus years, and I've built and deployed, many enterprise level systems for years and years now. The concept of organizing around platforms and creating commonality around how you operate, around the systems that you use, the tools that you use to build, and the agreeing to the rules of the road around how that platform is going to be used does tremendously reduce the cognitive load on all of those teams. They're not having to go out and invent things at every turn of events, right? They already defined how they're going to engage. They already defined how they're going to use the system. They've already defined the types of business cases that will be solved with this. So I'm seeing more and more kind of this platform thinking. And I know recently you were on a conversation with Jay Bloom from
Yep.
Ergonomic,
Yep.
and the conversation you guys had around just the concept of cognitive load when people aren't having to go out and invent answers or find solutions to problems because you've already decided on a set of capabilities is huge. And it's one of the reasons why we bill ourselves as a platform, because we've done a lot of that work for our customers.
Yep, absolutely. And it remains a super important part of the conversation. Things change and things remain the same. But I think it's preferable to have an existing runtime platform that is simply right there for you, able to accept new development, new workloads, as opposed to older models where we would define standards. We would say, well, the defined platform is, Oracle and WebSphere and blah, blah, blah. But oh, by the way, you got to go buy all that stuff. And then it's like, well, why am I going to buy that stuff? Why don't I buy something else? And then you're in these policing conversations. But when the platform is just there and it's available, ideally with a budget code or with minimal friction, you can start actually creating business value. I think it does actually reduce the variation, and we actually start to see faster time to market, which is exactly what we need to move the needle on that top line conversation that we were talking about with the effects, the value. All right. So if I may, just a little plug of the Enterprise Architecture Awards. We've been running these since 2010. I pulled a report the other night. We have given 64 different companies the award. Some companies have won more than once. So this is now in progress. I have a blog out, and I would encourage anybody out there who would like to submit their organization. You still have just about a month, so plenty of time. And it's going to be a great honor for the first year. This is the first year that the Open Group is partnering with us on these. Super excited to be working with them. Great organization. And with that brings, I think, my part of this conversation to a close.
Excellent. Thank you, Charlie. I appreciate your insights and the insights of Forrester. I know we've known each other in the industry for a lot of years, and there's a reason why you were the perfect person to have this conversation with us. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about what we at ServiceNow are doing to help EAs. There's a couple things that we do. Obviously, we have APM and SPM as capabilities within the platform, but in Q1 of this year, we actually launched something called the EA Workspace in ServiceNow. It's a store release. It's available in our store, but really it is a overlay to APM and some of the SPM capabilities and other core platform capabilities that allow someone who is in an EA role to actually create a workspace, or it's actually a natively defined workspace that they can customize to get views around all of the different systems and platforms that they are responsible for or that exist in the enterprise. It's a very easy to use UI. It doesn't necessarily replace some of your modeling tools and the other capabilities, but I would say it works very well alongside that to give you a view into things that are important to the modern EA. Getting down into different insights, looking at orphan business processes, looking at different software, hardware models that are at risk, looking at end of life or things that are nearing end of life, so be your planning, et cetera. there's a lot of different capabilities in this workspace that automatically highlight some things that would be important to the majority of the EAs that we work with in our customer base. I won't spend a lot of time digging into this. It's really something I think that it's worth looking at if you're a ServiceNow customer, you have enterprise architects, or you're in an enterprise architect role, and you want to start looking at the different portfolios that you're responsible for, that your company is responsible for, as it relates to the different systems that are out there that you're looking at from an EA perspective. So it brings a lot of things, it creates a lot of transparency, and puts everything in a single pane of glass that gives you better control, better visibility into what's happening in those areas. So that's the quick plug. Take a look at the EA workspaces available on the ServiceNow store, and I guarantee that you'll find something of value in there. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the webinar. Thank you guys for your time today. Charlie, thank you for being on here with me today. It's been a great conversation as always.
Yep. Very much enjoyed it.